think it was in 1997 that CDS, Centre for Disability Studies, had its 20th anniversary. And it was a great celebration. We had some videos made, and people enjoyed looking at the history of CDS that came through in those videos. And there was a sense in which, well, comments to me actually, that wouldn't it be really good if we could record some of the stories of some of the people that have really been the stakeholders of CDS over those 20 years. And for me, that meant, you know, talking to some of the long-serving staff, particularly the first director, who I know is part of this interview series, and also people like Dr. Sita de Versela, that set up the first clinic for people with intellectual disabilities and family members at CDS. Clinical Professor Dr. Vivian Richies, who brought to CDS her knowledge associated with employment, and so I could go on. Not only the staff, I think there was also a sense at that celebration that our stakeholders included people with disability and also family members. And so in talking with David and other colleagues, we decided that why not try and do this with the theme of really interviewing people and trying to get a sense of how far have we come? How far have we come, basically, in terms of the mission of CDS, which really is full inclusion.
Hi, you're watching the beginning of a series that we're starting off here at CDS, looking at the different people that are connected with the Centre for Disability Studies as a way of introducing everyone to the expertise and skills that are associated with the Centre for Disability Studies, and just letting you know a bit about what we do as an organisation. And we're really privileged to have as our first guest the founding director of the Centre for Disability Studies, Professor Trevor Parmenter. From 1997 until his retirement on the 4th of December 2009, Professor Emeritus Trevor Parmenter held the Foundation Chair of the Developmental Disability in the Sydney Medical School, University of Sydney. He is an honorary professor in the faculties of Education and Social Work and Health Sciences at the University of Sydney, and adjunct professor in the School of Rural Medicine, University of New England. He held the co-joint position of the Director of the Centre for Disability Studies at the Royal Rehabilitation Centre, Sydney. Former positions include Professorial Fellow and Director of the Unit for Community Integration Studies at Macquarie University, prior to which he held teaching and administrative positions in the New South Wales Department of Education and Training. He is a past president of the International Association for the Scientific Study of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, and former ex officio member of the board of the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disability. He has worked closely with the World Health Organization and the International Labour Organization. In 2005, he was appointed a member of the Order of Australia for his contributions to research, teaching, and services to people with developmental disabilities. In 2010, the Senate of the University of Sydney conferred on him the title of Professor Emeritus in recognition of his distinguished research and teaching career. He has published widely on disability issues, including employment, supported living, classification of support needs, behaviour support, mental and physical health, quality of life, autism, family studies, ageing, policy development, and program evaluation. Thank you so much for joining us, Trevor.
No, it's a pleasure, David. It's well, both a pleasure and quite an honour to be a part of this series. I think it's a wonderful initiative because, as you know from our meetings, I have a very deep regard and, in fact, a deep love for what the centre is doing.
Oh, wonderful. Well, given that this is the beginning of our series, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about CDS and how it came to be. So what was the idea behind CDS, and what was the need that it was set up to fulfill?
I think we need to go back to the context in which the dream, as it were, developed. If you go back to the period of the normalization principle, and which then led to the deinstitutionalization of some of the large institutions around the world, the concept of disability was undergoing quite a different perspective in terms of how people viewed disability as a term, and the people who were so described with it. And insofar as the early, there was an antipathy really towards what was called the medical model, because people were seen as having an impairment, which then led to a disability. The focus seemed to be very, very much on what was called the medical model. I could talk for ages about how some of the medical model was misconceived, but there was a real antipathy towards that. And so when I first started to research and work at Macquarie University in 1974, we concentrated very, very much on, interestingly, we concentrated on trying to help people with intellectual disabilities learn better, and in fact to overcome an impairment. So in a way, I somewhat critically say, well, we were still following the medical model because we were trying to change the person. It wasn't until I got underway with my research, particularly into employment, community living, that I suddenly realized that the environment was a key factor. And we seemed to be missing the point in our research in fragmenting the person into little pieces. You know, even employment, community living, and so on, transition, another issue that I was working with together with colleagues. We were tending to fragment the person. Then I came across readings in the sociology of disability, which really transformed my thinking. Now, you might say, what has all this got to do with the development of CDS? Well, I guess it was in the early 90s that colleagues and I started thinking about what was missing. Particularly, we had this concept of trying to avoid the medical model. We were consciously trying to help people live in the community better, have a more satisfying life. But there seemed to be something missing because we weren't looking at the person's whole life. We'd fragmented it. And so that was the germ, in my mind at least, that led me to think about a different model. Just coincidentally, a couple of medicos who were became very close friends, Dr. Michael Ryan had worked in the developmental disability medicine within the state health system. And he saw, with the closing down of the institutions, there may have been a diminution of emphasis on health. And he got quite worried about that. He thought it would be useful to establish a chair in medicine within a university such as Sydney that could make sure that the health aspect was not lost, because it was being lost. The move from the Department of Health to the Department of Community Services for the support systems marked quite a distinctive change in the 1980s in New South Wales and other states as well, which did lead to a lessening of the concentration on a person's health needs. The other doctor was Dr. Bob Oakeshott, who was the then medical director at the Royal Rehabilitation Centre, where I'd done some research work, particularly in their community living program. And Bob said to me, look, Trevor, I think we need to be looking at people with developmental disabilities. We have a number of them in our community living program, people with cerebral palsy, some with intellectual disabilities, and some with other physical disabilities. And he said, we just don't have this broad concept on looking at people, particularly those who were born with a disability, because the Royal Rehab Centre was set up mainly to look at people who were post-injury, post-trauma. So those two doctors really influenced our thinking, and we put together a small group with members from other medical areas, health and community services. And the Department of Community Services then chaired this small group and helped to develop a memorandum of understanding, which was signed by the Dean of Medicine, the then Minister for Community Services, in the state government. This was signed at Parliament House in 1995. And money was set aside, and work was done on how we would then develop this new centre, which was going to be called the Centre for Developmental Disability Studies. We tried to recruit a director. That wasn't successful in the first round. Some people dropped out. One of the problems was it was a 5-year contract, and some people were worried about the term of the contract and whether the money would keep coming through from government sources, not just the Department of Community Service, but also the Department of Health put money in, the Royal Rehab Centre, the Spastic Centre of New South Wales, and Macquarie University gave some in-kind support, which was namely my position. However, in the second round, I was encouraged to apply for the directorship, and I was appointed in 1997. So that's the sort of background to how the centre became developed and the rationale for it. And the rationale was very, very much a whole of life approach, health being significantly present, but way beyond health. We were looking at the whole person. I think the research pathway that has emerged over the 23 years has been pretty faithful to that original concept. And of course, other centres were developed in Australia, but those centres did tend to, the one in Melbourne in particular and the one in Queensland, and a smaller centre developed in Flinders University, they still very much health focused, which was fine, and have done some very sterling work there. But I think the key message from the CDDS's development was this concept of looking at the total life perspective and trying not to fragment the person too much.
Well, that's fascinating. So given that there's been huge amounts of kind of change from deinstitutionalization, the adoption of kind of a more social model of disability, moving away from a purely medical model, what would you say what have been the main kind of areas in which things have progressed since CDS was founded, in your opinion?
I think we have helped quite significantly some of the conceptualizations and the practice of helping people have a much richer life in the community. I think the various studies that we undertook and which the centre is still undertaking, particularly the focus on inclusion, I think despite we have a long way to go, and we're often at times I wonder whether we've taken some steps backward. I think overall, I go back on my career right from when I started teaching people in schools in 1953, I still believe we've made great strides in helping people with disabilities become part of a community. And I think we've helped them develop their identity. And when I look at some of the work we're doing in self-advocacy, I'm just struck by how people I taught in a special school in the early 1970s are now holding executive positions in self-advocacy groups and speaking out and really showing that they've developed into very highly functioning, thoughtful people. And this was not dreamt of back in the early 70s, 80s. So we have come a long way. We've got much further, much more to do. One of the interesting things is I'm still finding now a piece of research I'm currently doing with an organisation on transition to work programs. I'm still quite dumbstruck that work that was done on the transition issue in the 1990s with people like Professor Vivian Ritchie's. It's almost as though it was never done, because we're still facing the same structural problems And some of the problems now in a transition, I find are still probably more profound than they were back in the 1990s. I think that's an area that we must further explore. Yes, I think I'm very optimistic.
Yeah, wonderful.
About the trajectory of our work, and I think we have contributed quite a lot. The health issue, that was a big struggle to get that to almost have a more inclusive research centres. We had to battle very hard to get that. And I think when I look back over the achievements of CDS, I think getting those clinics more formally situated within the Department of Health has been a wonderful achievement. And that's taken almost the 23 years that the centre has existed. And that was quite a long battle that we helped lead together with other organisations.
So Trevor, you've had a very long and illustrious research career. I wonder whether you could talk a bit about whether there's any kind of key themes in your research that you've focused on at different stages of your career.
Well, you mentioned a whole list of topics that I've been interested in and have published in over my research life. It started to worry me when you started listing all those, because it really goes against my view that we should have a more holistic approach. And each of those are more, little silos of studies.
Sure.
But I think the glue that holds them all together is my passion for quality of life. I think I worked on that with international colleagues and continue to do so. And I think that, in a sense, helps to epitomise and brings together this whole of life concept. And it's not just a whole of life in a chronological sense, but it's looking at a person's whole of life in the here and now. And I think that's what, for future researchers, I think we must keep that in mind, that we do tend to fragment the person's life, because the research grants are quite specific, that we must stick to a very focused set of aims, which tend to lead us into almost an atomization of a person's life.
Yeah.
And I think the role of the centre is also to not always create new research, but to translate existing research. And I think that's been another strength of CDS. Its translational work, particularly through its training. And the training is based heavily on CDS's own research, but it's also based on the research of others, and sort of synthesises good practice. And I think one of the strengths of CDS, beyond, or compared rather, to other similar research centres, is that hands-on practical translation of knowledge into the field, and really trying to keep the whole person. And we look at the Uni 2 Beyond, and we look at the other work that's being done in the with inclusive research work, which is where we made great strides since I left, and under the directorship of Patricia. It's just been fantastic to see that inclusive research work grow. I think that gives me a feeling of a sense of completeness, that CDS hasn't lost sight of the whole person.
Yeah. I imagine there would be economic reasons why there would be focused on fragmenting the person, wouldn't there? In that it would be more economically efficient to have super specialized services looking at different parts of a person's life. And I guess, is there a sense in which the reason that what was holding back people from focusing on the person as a whole, as a person, that it wasn't economically efficient or something like that?
Well, when you mentioned economics, it might be the economics of the ARC grant body that funds a lot of
right.
And it's structured. Again, a lot of the scientific research follows in a way. It does follow the laboratory-based model, even though we've moved on, particularly outside of the NHMRC grants, which are very solely directed towards quite specific clinical issues. And that's why we have trouble winning a lot of NHMRC grants, because we tend to take a process that's not laboratory based or clinically based.
Mm.
In addition, that doesn't belie the importance of the clinical work. Yes, I guess it's the economics in a sense is not the economics vis-a-vis money, but it's the economics of trying to distill something into a manageable piece of work. And that's why you can study transition, but you can study employment. But I realized in my early employment work that I could not. And against I used to argue with some of my American colleagues who would be very focused on the training of people to get a job. And I said, hang on a bit, if we don't look at their relationships, which often are the reason they don't get a job or they lose a job, if we don't look at relationships, all this work on employment training is not going to go anywhere. And interesting, the ones that opposed me on that sort of thinking eventually came around to do the same research we were doing when we moved out of employment itself to looking at a broader perspective and how relationships, and again, that brought us into the quality of life paradigm. I think that's the trick of the role of the centre, and that is to try and stand back and work out as far as possible. And we often don't have the latitude because we're trying to keep alive financially, but to stand back and say, what are some of the big things we should be doing in the research world? In other words, contributing to the research agenda that bodies like the ARC and NMHRC should have. I just completed a survey for ARC, and some of my criticism was that disability research is not a priority in the national priorities that are listed. And I pointed out that if we follow the Institute of Health and Welfare and the ABS data, 1 in 5 people have a disability, as defined by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare and the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Some may say that's an inflated figure, but that's the figure that we're using in statistics and in the census. So if 1 in 5 people have a disability, and then we link into that the families that it also impacts upon, Australia has a really sizable research, should have a sizable research agenda for looking into the issues of disability. So I made that point in the survey. Hopefully someone might take notice of it.
Yeah, here's hoping.
Yes.
Finally, I suppose the last question I'd love your ideas on. If someone was to be thinking about starting a research career in the area of disability studies, what would be some kind of fruitful areas of research that you'd suggest for, say, a PhD project or a postdoctoral project or something like that?
Well, can I go back to a blog I wrote recently about the recent Tune review of the NDIS, the Tune review. And one of the points made in that review was that so many of the people who were administering the NDIS across Australia had very little appreciation of the lived experience of people with disabilities. And I think if I were advising a prospective researcher, someone coming into the field like a PhD student or an existing research center, an existing researcher, such as many of them you have at CDS, I would start by saying, how about we start going back to really the basis of the ontology and epistemology of disability. I think we need to recover that philosophical understanding. So once upon a time, before a person, when a person undertook a PhD program at universities, there was a compulsory topic, which is the philosophy of science. And
I taught that subject for a little while.
Yes.
As a tutor, yeah.
Well, it's not compulsory anymore.
Yeah.
And I think that's where I'd start. Sadly, some of the topics that I've been researching through my long career, I think are still pertinent. I think we still need to look at the issue of transition, the issue of employment, and in a much broader way, and the issue of community living. But I think the key topic that is going to challenge us is still inclusion. At various parts of the person's life, right through their lifespan. Inclusion in the preschool, school, post-school, and so on, right through to their inclusion in the aged care system. And I guess given the pandemic that we're going through at the moment, I do believe there's going to be quite a societal upheaval post this pandemic. And I really, as I thought about future research topics, I think it's where will people fit, people with disabilities, where will they fit within any realignments that we see, economic realignments, social realignments. And it's going to throw up, I think, some more challenges for us in the very topic of inclusion. I would advise a prospective researcher also, other than the basic understanding of the philosophies, to also go back to basic research and look at what I don't think we're linking into basic research enough. We get very disability centric. And I think we should go to some of the basic research in psychology and philosophy, sociology, and medicine, education, particularly in our field of developmental disabilities, cognitive science, and link into that and see if we can become more inclusive in our research efforts and build upon the work of people who don't work in the disability area at all. I think that might help us become develop a more inclusive research mentality. But I guess, yes, I would list issues around inclusion are still going to become the premium ones, because I don't think, much as we have struggled to bring about a full acceptance as a fellow human being, people are still looked down upon in a very hierarchical structure, sadly still linked very much to cognitive capacities. And I think this is going to be an ongoing challenge to be accepting of the diversity and the value of people as basic human beings with equitable needs and desires and resources. And I think, you know, I can go into the whole area of the economic disparities in our society, and people with disabilities are always going to be in the bottom rung. So I think the challenges are across. I'd go to the basic disciplines, economics, history, and so on, and try to link our research projects in the world view of what's happening in the world today. Ask ourselves the question, where does a person with a developmental disability going to sit in this world? And as the world changes, those questions will need to be further refined. Even though I deplore the fact that we are still needing to research things which have been researched over the last several decades. The world has changed, and so even though we despair about why haven't people put our early research into practice, the world is different. And it's not just a simple matter of saying, you know, a research paper written in 1957 is now going to be relevant in 2020, or is it going to be relevant in 2030? And that might be my final comment. That in my career, I've tried to look above the horizon and ask the question, where will we be in 10 years, 15 years time? It's a bit like the climate problem. We're making goals for 2030, 2050. I think CDS and the colleagues that we have there probably could look at where would we want people to be with a developmental disability or with any disability in 2030. Let's start with 2030.
What a wonderful place to end up our conversation. Thanks so much for joining me, Trevor. It's been a real privilege to hear about your experience and knowledge.
All my privilege, David.
Great.
And all the very best with this set of interviews.